everyone. Good evening. I'm Merope Mills. Welcome to Tortoise. Welcome to our special ThinkIn this evening with Gina Miller, the brilliant businesswoman, author, campaigner, activist for 30 years, who famously took on the government and won twice over Brexit. I don't know if some of the people who've joined us tonight were supposed to be joining us. I just reminded Gina that she was supposed to be joining us in what was around the first week of lockdown in our actual physical newsroom in Fitzrovia. Obviously, so much has changed since then. Our newsroom has become completely digital and all our think-ins have moved online, but the principle of the ThinkIn remains the same, which is to say it's not a panel event. It's not me and Gina talking for an hour, sort of Q&A. It's loosely based on a news organisation news conference where we try and get special guests in and talk about interesting ideas of the moment, and for that reason they work best when we hear from as many people in the digital room as possible. And I'll talk you through the ways that you can do that and get involved and talk to Gina. You can raise your digital hand, and you can do that by clicking on the participants tab at the bottom, and then you'll see a list of names, and at the bottom a little raise hand will come up. I will show you. I'm sure you can have a little practice there if you want, or if you don't want to talk and would rather type, we have a chat function where my colleague Liz Mosley, who will now give you one of her friendly waves, there she is ready to chat to you if you would like to say something there, and I'd love to bring in as many people and voices as possible. And I should say as well that we do record these sessions in case we want to use them or share them on our digital platforms later for members who couldn't join us tonight. Gina, it seems incredibly fitting now that we are talking tonight of all nights, because obviously this week the face-to-face talks, trade talks with the EU and the UK resumed this week, and tonight I believe is the deadline for any extension to the transition period. And it feels fitting that the right question I should ask you at this point tonight, and the first question is, are your Brexit campaigning days now behind you? Is that chapter closed?
Hi, good evening, everyone. First of all, thank you for inviting me to chat with everyone tonight. My Brexit campaigning days stopped at the end of February, actually. And from the reality of the situation we were in, because when I saw the legislation, both in the Withdrawal Act, and I read it very carefully, I looked at the political declaration because it wasn't the original draft that had been earlier in 2019. When I looked at that, against a backdrop of the manifesto, the Conservative Party manifesto, that 80-seat majority, plus the fact that we were also starting to talk about coronavirus and what was coming, I thought it was inevitable that we would go for no extension, and that the ideologues would probably be in positions of power. And I suspected that under the new powers that were in the draft Corona Emergency Act, in that bill, that they would probably get away with quite a lot. So I have to say, I moved on to the practicality of what are the issues we're facing as we move forwards.
Okay, and I can see Christine Knight-Morder is asking, how do you feel about where we are now with no extension request, no deal?
I still think it's a huge mistake, but you know, you can't cry over spilt milk. I think that the ideology is now so entrenched that there's very little that won't be sacrificed on the altar of Brexit or a hard Brexit, but all of it sits in the court of this government. And the rest of us, unfortunately, are powerless to do anything much at the moment, including the opposition.
Okay. And you know, without the EU as the bogeyman for a large sector of the British population, combined with the after effects of COVID, you know, what do you think what do you predict the outlook for the next few years of British politics will be?
Oh my gosh, that's a huge question.
It's a big question. I guess I'm asking about how tolerant a country you will think we will be without?
So if I can unpack that question a little. First of all, with the EU, I think that there were already, I was never a, no questions asked, black and white. I've never seen things in black and white, Remain, and that was it. I always saw it as much more nuanced, that as the challenges of the future, because I have to say, one of the things I think coronavirus or this pandemic is doing is it's highlighting issues that have been there for a while, that were already rumbling, but they've put them into stark relief now. And so, a lot of the issues I saw coming down the line, not just myself and many other people, we saw them as having to be combated on a global collaborative basis, that multilateral organizations would really come into their own, in that many of the challenges are issues without borders. And so I was hoping that we would be part of something where we'd use our soft power to really reform the EU to make it more fit for purpose for the issues we had going forwards. That did not happen. We actually are seeing quite the opposite, in that I think we're seeing a real threatening of other multilateral organizations as we go through this pandemic. And I am fearful that the EU will both suffer, and perhaps in this pandemic, we've seen some of that, in that if I give some examples in the way some of the monetary sort of payouts have happened, but also things like a very practical way they've approached their test and trace apps. Because actually, if you have a European Union and free movement, why didn't they club together and develop a European app? Why were different countries not sharing the technology? Why was Germany racing ahead with what they was doing and not sharing that with other countries? So there are questions to be asked about the fact that the European Union itself was not living up to its own principles in the way they've actually combated this, in some areas, in the way they've combated this crisis, this pandemic.
And would you trace that back to Brexit as being responsible for the European Union not working together?
No, there's always been an inner and outer European Union. There's always been a German Franco axis to the Union. And that is what has actually upset some of the newer southern states. And that's something the EU is going to have to deal with. But from a UK point of view, what I think has happened, and what I'm very concerned about, is the way that we are moving forwards now. Because we cannot be this isolated nation when we have such big global problems. And at some point, rhetoric is going to run out. And the reality of the situation is that we're not a colonialist nation. We do not have the powers of empire. One of our strongest strengths was actually our soft power. And we managed to exercise that incredibly well through years of membership, both of the European Union, but other organizations. And I think the way we are behaving as a nation and as a government is damaging that reputation. And I think in the long term, we'll pay the price for that.
There's a campaign in the chat for me to ask a question. I don't know if it's Ishitha Islam. You're very welcome to ask it yourself. But she says, "Hi Gina, what do you think the political motives were behind the merging of the DFID and the FCO was?"
Oh my gosh, it's about power. I mean, unfortunately, we already knew that was sort of going to happen, because one of the things that the new ideology, if you like, in the Conservative Party believe is that we should look after our nation. It's about protectionism and nationalism. That's part of it, I believe. Some of it is also, if you look at it, is that those people, the DFID is now going to report to Dominic Raab in the Foreign Office. And this idea that they see that trade and aid are actually intrinsically tied, which I don't believe they are. But that is now, it's a, if you like, it's showing the true colors of the way we will go forwards. So we would use on one hand, we would use trade to dominate, if you like, or almost blackmail, actually, is probably a better word, in my opinion, to say how we're going to go forwards when it comes to aid. So it will be linked to, aid will be linked to trade. And to me, that is where I think we've lost some of our moral compass.
Okay, thank you. I can see that Andrew Gerbwood's got a question. I'd love to know if you, Andrew, would want to ask it to Gina yourself. Otherwise, I will keep going. In 2017, Gina, you were named as the most influential Black person in the UK. I mean, you've obviously been subject to the most extraordinary amount of racist abuse. I've got some of the things people have said to you here, from the colour of your skin, you're a piece of shit and shit should be trodden on you, and, you know, terrible stuff. But what I wanted to ask you is, when you see the Black Lives Matter movement that's sprung up in the last few months, do you, and a huge response to that, do you have hopes for the next generation of Black people in Britain, and particularly your children? What are your thoughts when you see that?
My thoughts are that it's very complicated. And so much of this has been, like so many issues, it becomes dichotomous, very black and white. And I think it's much more complicated than that. It is, when I just go back to the example, when in 2017 I was named, the promoters of a Powerlist were incredibly brave to choose me as the most powerful Black woman, and a Black individual. And they did that for a reason, because we were having a conversation about the fact that there was a particular political message that was going out, which was about, or if you like, ambition to divide and conquer. So there was very nuanced messages where they were pitting, especially in the referendum, pitting one ethnic group against the other. And the problem with that is we needed to come together. And by choosing me, it was trying to bring this idea together, that it's not Asian against Black, it's not brown against Black, it's not a different colored skin. We wanted to make it about the fact that BAME, B-A-M-E, is not, we're not one holistic group. We're actually, there is no such thing. There's no such ethnicity as BAME. We are all different. And so when I was awarded that, the abuse I got for getting that award was quite extraordinary. But what was most instructive is the quarters that the abuse was coming from. So I got abuse from quite a lot of the Black community saying I wasn't Black. I got a lot of abuse from the Asian community saying, how could I have accepted that award when I'm not Black, I'm Asian. And then lots of people on the sort of more traditional racism that I would normally encounter saying, oh, you're not a powerful woman, you have lots of powerful white men behind you. So it literally came from just about every quarter. But I was prepared for that, and we were making a very strong point in me actually accepting that award. And I have the same when I speak at events like, you know, the Black Lawyers Awards, which sadly, there should be no Black Lawyers Awards, but there are. But the fact is, the Black Lives Movement is much more complicated than that, in my view, because it's built on hundreds of years of injustice, but it starts with judicial and social injustice. Because if you have a system that basically is built on punish and incarcerates certain elements of society when they supposedly misbehave because of the way that they're being denied access to rights that all the rest of us have access to, education, social justice, you know, equality, then what happens is the way you control those elements of society is that you punish them. And there is no rehabilitation there. So hundreds of years of punishment to subdue parts of the society rather than addressing the human indignity of not giving them access and treating them as lesser citizens is much more nuanced than just saying Black Lives Matter. And that's what I worry about, the fact that there are so many people jumping on this bandwagon that we end up, everyone's now worried about what they say about this. Everyone's worried about what you say about racism. Racism is about inhumanity and exists wherever it exists in all its forms, should be addressed, and nobody owns it. And that's the thing that's happening now, is that somehow there's a group of people who are saying we own inequality, we own racism. That is not right in my view.
Okay, I mean, funny enough, hearing you talking, it sounds similar. I know that you had reservations about the Metoo movement for the same
reasons. Yes,
you feel like it conflates too many things. Is that right?
Yes, because if, for example, in the Metoo movement, what happened is that the sexual equality voices got suppressed, if you like, because suddenly there was somebody else was taking up the oxygen. And my view very strongly is no group should put themselves above another, because what happens is you make yourself more important. And I think we should call out inequality. We address it at certain times. What I do think now about the Black Lives Movement is this is the time where we should give those messages, but that doesn't mean that other types of racism don't exist. So there's a time and a place to, if you like, highlight a particular issue and really address the structural apparatus that needs to happen to create change. That happened in the Metoo movement, it's happening with Black Lives Matter, but it's not just about pulling down the statue, being part of the movement. It has got to be much more complex than that and much more fundamental in the change that we all want to pursue. Because the other thing is, when you talk about equality in all its forms, whatever the equality conversation you're having, there are going to be a group or other people who perceive it that they're losing something. So if one person's gaining something, there's a perception that another group is losing it. And so what we need to do is take people along with us in that conversation so everybody can see the benefit of equality rather than feeling that they're losing something.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Gina. Can I go to Andrew Gerbwood, who was asking some questions in the chat before, and then Sally Young, if she's available.
Hi there. I'm suddenly conscious that you've probably been asked this question hundreds of times and are fed up, but I'm going to push on anyway.
Be brave, Andrew.
I'm hardly ever fed up, so it's okay.
I'm amazed at the powerful and apparently learned people who pushed and fought for Brexit, and I can't work out why. What was in it for them? Is it tax evasion, power, British exceptionalism? What do you think?
Oh my gosh, I think there's no one answer. I can only feed back to you, Andrew, the people I've met who I've had this conversation with, because I spent most of the 4 years talking to people who don't agree with me, because I think you get more insight when you do that rather than hiding in a comfort zone. And it is a mix. There are those who are, pursuit of profit. It's about lower regulation, thinking the EU has somehow tells them, what to do, especially in my sector in financial services. There's this huge idea that what we're going to do is we're going to be released from regulation. We're going to suddenly be able to diverge and go to this green new pastures. Well, the rest of the world is converging, not diverging. So, wait to see what happens there. But there's that. There's also this idea there are people who are basically were Eurosceptics 45 years ago and never bought into the EU project in the first place. So there's that little enclave. But also there are, some of my friends who I would never have imagined would have been Brexiteers, whilst they're incredibly intelligent people in what they do in their job and their thinking, they believe the propaganda. They really did believe some of it was so clever the way they got under people's skin. And this is where technology is so dangerous in, if you like, destabling our democracy, because even the brightest of people can fall for some of these messages. So it's complex. It's much more complicated than that. And I think one of the things that many people didn't understand was they saw the whole EU project and Brexit being about trade and freedoms and not about peace. Because if you fundamentally understand that it is a peace project first, and then everything else came from that, I think they would have changed their minds. But it is an array, it's a huge disappointment for me that people didn't really look at the details and the facts. And that's people from all walks of life.
Okay. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Gina. And Sally, if you're there.
Yeah, I'm here.
Hello, Sally.
I'm hopefully unmuted now. Yeah, hello.
Hi,
good evening.
Sally.
Hi. Thank you, Gina. You've taken on quite a lot of controversial issues in your life. I might agree with you on the Brexit one completely, but issues about charity costs and other things. I'd like to know a little bit more about your values and your drivers when you are taking on, in some instances, particularly unpopular causes. What keeps you going, and why do you do it? And how can you do it?
Oh gosh, good question. I decided a while ago, I've been a campaigner for 30 years, and I started campaigning because of my eldest daughter. So she's now 32 years old, and the fact that she wouldn't, because at the time I didn't have the money or the access to expensive lawyers or specialists to get her access to special needs provision in schools, just infuriated me. I thought it must be a right for all children to have access to that. So my first campaign was to try and get the statements available for all children. And, I contributed to the Special Needs Act in '96. And that was my first big campaign, and that was driven by passion. And as I became more successful as a businesswoman, I realized something, which was, because I'm a sort of a very, if you like, I was going to say disruptive, but many people call me disruptive. But if you like, I'm an entrepreneurial fidget, in that I don't fit well into any particular corporate box. I sort of built my business as an entrepreneur, which gave me an independence that I realized gave me power, because I'm not relying on other people's money. I'm not part of any club. I am actually an outsider, but that gives me an independence, which means if I have a knowledge in an area, I can actually challenge the status quo, because I don't have much to lose from the point of view that their power is going to somehow, or their influence is going to affect me. And that I realized was a real privilege. So I tend to take on things that are very difficult, if you like, and you normally would not, people wouldn't speak up and put their heads above the parapet, because they have that reality that they have a mortgage, they have to earn their living, they're responsible to a corporate voice and to an industry voice. Whereas my freedom, my financial freedom and my business freedom allows me to do that, and my personal freedom, because I really don't care what anybody says about me. As long as I'm doing something that I think is right, I will go for it. So I'm driven by my purpose, but also the fact that I feel that my success gives me a responsibility.
I can see lots of questions being asked in the chat, and I can't keep up with them. So if you do have a question, the best way is to stick your digital hand up. I can see Ricard is doing that. I will come to you, Ricard, in a second, but I will ask one that I just read, which was from Helen Painter, who says her 17-year-old daughter, who's a budding politician, is in the room with her. What advice would you have for her in a future politician?
Gosh, well, I'd say that being 17 years old, you are fortunate to be living at a time where we're going to go through more change than probably we've seen for 100 years. This is the next revolution. And being 14 years old with a voice, with a conscience, with the ability to harness social media technology and understand how you can be so effective now as a campaigner, and how you can be so effective to use your voice in a positive way to spread messages. I think if you can be part of that army, a digital army of activists with a conscience, then you are so valuable. Don't give up, but you also must, I suggest, be able to have enough confidence to switch off on the abusers, because whilst the technology allows you to have an amplified voice, not just nationally, but internationally, it also allows the abusers to have an amplified voice. And just remember, they're the few, not the many.
Thank you. Can I go to Ricard, who has got his hand up? I'd like to come back to that point in a second, though.
Hi, such a privilege to be able to ask you a question, Gina. I've got a question about democracy and populism and so on, which is, I read a lot that there are signs that our democracy is under threat by populism that can lead to authoritarianism, and that through a series of incremental steps that are practically imperceptible, we're sliding towards something very, very dangerous. I think this is true, but and sometimes I read that, you know, we haven't learned the lessons of history, that this is how the Nazis rose to power in Germany, etc., and that we all ought to be concerned about that, obviously. So I'd be really interested to know whether you think democracy is under threat, whether this phenomenon is occurring, and given the intersection with technology and the ability to amplify voices and so on, whether the risk is even greater now, and what should we do about it?
Gosh, again, a really complex question, but I do think our democracy is under threat. If I start nationally first, rather than internationally, nationally, I think if you read page 48 of the Conservative Manifesto, I couldn't believe how few people actually read that page and understood the threats that are hidden in that page, because the idea that you would politicize the judiciary, that you would say that you would not allow certain things, so judicial review, judges could be a political appointment, the fact now that there are more executive powers being put forward plainly than have ever been put forward before, the fact that we will change possibly the boundary changes so that the Conservatives could end up with even more power in future rather than what they have now, the changes to the civil service. I mean, that page is dangerous in its own right, but if you look at what's happened since then, I mean, I'll go forward before I go backwards, but the political appointment of our head of defense is extraordinary. Is the fact you have somebody who knows more about whiskey than he does about security or defense or terrorism. He used to be, by the way, the CEO of the Whiskey Association. That's why I say that. But, you know, what's happening there is a power shift is happening. There are fewer and fewer voices who can stand up to the government. And whilst I didn't think we were going to be able to win a coalition government or anything like that, I was hoping that in the election, what we do is we dent that huge majority, because as pollsters, we were running every day. We knew that majority or something around that was going to come, especially as we got close to the election. But we thought if there was a, say, 10 to 20 seat majority, that gives us more of a democracy than having a massive majority that creates more of a move towards an authoritarian state with people around them, advisors who do have an ideology. And so that was our aim at the time. But, you know, what is happening now is almost a playbook, Ricardo, of what has happened so many times in history.
Right.
And the playbook of authoritarian regimes is you discredit elites, you create the politics of division, of othering, you dismiss the judges, you politicize the judiciary, and you also then create this narrative that people must not trust certain elements of society. But I think we can change this. We can change it through technology, because I know many people say that technology is very disabling. Yes, it is. But what we have to do is regulate those who are disabling it. Some of the platforms, the majority is the platforms, you know, let's bring in that legislation as soon as possible. In the UK, autumn, I think we should be doing the online harms bill. But at the same time, internationally, we shouldn't be jumping into bed with those governments and leaders who are also going down this more authoritarian path. You know, we in the UK could actually be a beacon of hope for the future if we decide that what we're going to go back to is, and we don't know if this government will or won't, but if we go back to understanding that being an equal society means that we stand up for each other. But at the moment, that's not what's happening. And I dread what's happening with the advisor, with Cummings. I mean, just to give you an example, I get another example. In the civil service, many of the SPADs, the advisors, were issued with new contracts of employment last November, where they report to Cummings, and he can actually sack them for whatever it is he deems as behavior that is not supportive of the government, or is not, conduct that is becoming of their position. I mean, when did that happen? It is absolutely extraordinary how the power is being concentrated in the hands of 4 or 5 people.
Thank you so much for that. I can see Maya Campbell's got her hand up. Lottie, you did have your hand up, but it's gone down. If you do want to say something, let me know. And then Joshua Rosenberg.
Hello everyone. Hi Gina. I'd just like to say firstly, I'm a massive fan of your work. You're a real inspiration to a lot of us. And I suppose the question I wanted to ask, I think you've answered it in part about how we can sort of use technology and things to impact change, but I want to know how, or whether you think we still can, given the page 48 stuff, how we can actually still use the courts to impact change, whether that be via judicial review. You know, do you think the whole judicial review route is going to be very difficult to go down, or do you think that there is some other way to perhaps utilize a part of law that does kind of still give us access to justice? Because I don't see access to justice in the Tory manifesto.
Thank you. Just my opinion, I know Joshua's on watching, but access to law is not just about judicial review. I mean, we have to address the legal aid system and those cuts, because that also denies people access to justice. But on specifically the judicial review route, one of the things I'm concerned about is because nobody saw the pandemic coming. And I understand on an emotional level what I'm going to say, but we also have to be cautious. But there are an awful lot of people who are using the tool of judicial review to bang on the doors of the courts because of what's going on with coronavirus and what they feel are the failings of the government, which I agree there have been many failings in the government. But if you bang on the court's doors too often, they'll say no. There's already a practical problem of the backlog of courts and cases when it comes to what's happened in the lockdown. And if you go, everybody starts, there's some, I think last time I looked or I heard, there were 44 cases where the courts are being approached on judicial review for PPE to lockdown to whatever it is at the moment. But we have to be careful how we use that tool, because judicial review is not just, it mustn't be tagged as being the tool for political questions asking of the court, because judicial review actually was used in Hillsborough for the young woman officer who committed suicide and highlighted the misogyny in the armed forces. It's there as a tool, not just for political cases. And I think when you have such a precious resource, you have to be careful how you use it. So that's the only thing I'm slightly concerned about, is the readiness to jump on what I call, ambulance chasing lawyers, to just jump on judicial review. I know how badly that would go down with lawyers, but I do worry about that. But those in the profession, those politicians, and I do think people will stand up, because I believe we're still going to have this commission, this constitutional commission that's going to go forwards, and we don't know any timing. Again, with the pandemic, we have no idea when that will be, or when they will have bandwidth to deal with this. But there are many things where coming down the line. But right now, I think the court of public opinion is very powerful, using that as a public platform. And we've seen the change that can do, and how you can bring matters to the fore by using the court of public opinion. And I think for right now, let's use that. Let's use our collective civic voices rather than running to the law right now.
Thank you. There are so many questions coming up thick and fast. I'm going to read out Lottie's because her camera isn't working. It is, how do we destroy narratives of white working class versus ethnic minority students in education? There's often a backlash when initiatives are down for BAME working class students, when the focus should be on those who are taking up more space, e.g. the white middle class. These conversations come up a lot within access to education and jobs. How do we change this narrative?
One of the things I'd suggest, and I'm not obviously a professional educator, but from the work I've done with schools, is you change the narrative, you change the language. So we keep talking about groups and the tribe and where everyone belongs, rather than trying to dig down to what are the things we're talking about. We're talking about human rights to education, the benefits of education. It's sort of changing the conversation. So you start from a different place, is where I suggest we need to combat some of those divisions.
Thank you. Thanks, Gina. And I'm now going to go to Joshua Rosenberg, who's got his hand up. Hello, Joshua. You look like you're in a professional studio. Oh, hang on. Can we hear you?
On, I think.
Can we unmute Joshua?
Yeah.
There you are.
Yeah, there we are. Gina, hi. Can I go back to your comments about judicial review? You're worried that the government is seeking to politicize the judiciary, and you're particularly worried about the announcements in the Conservative manifesto before the last election about judicial review. Do you think perhaps that what the government said it was going to do, and as you say, we haven't seen any sign of it yet, do you think that was in fact a reaction against the two cases that you brought? And do you think that perhaps your caution that you've just expressed for others who might be thinking of challenging the lockdown regulations, the other regulations, the British Airways challenging the 14 days quarantine, the various challenges that you've referred to, surely if people feel that the government has behaved unlawfully, then as you did, they should challenge the government in order to make sure the government acts lawfully. But on the other hand, if you do that, you're saying that maybe the government is going to react by limiting judicial review, as the Lord Chief Justice seems quite comfortable with. So I'm not quite sure really why you're saying other people shouldn't do what you yourself did so successfully and dramatically.
What I'm saying is we should exercise caution and look at it from the black and white letter of the law rather than any element of emotion. And to give you an example of what I mean by that, for example, it's one of the cases I'm aware of where they're bringing cases for the lack of care and duty of care when it came to the elderly in care homes. Well, that case is actually being brought against, or the judicial review is being brought against, Matt Hancock is a named defendant in that. But actually the black and white letter of the law, if that were to be heard, it's the care homes and the trust that would actually be responsible, not Matt Hancock. So whilst the emotion is a political one to go after Matt Hancock, that isn't going to necessarily be the outcome if that case was to be won. So what I'm saying is think carefully about who you are actually naming in those cases and what the outcome could be if you won. Whereas my case, there were many other cases that were being looked at, but we were very careful that we were only restricting ourselves to the black and white letter of the law and the Constitution. And that's where I would say, let's practice caution before the courts just decide that they're being overwhelmed by approaches.
Thank you. Thanks both. Can I just, before I go to some other hands, can I just ask you something? Because you touched on, the need to regulate the platforms, the tech platforms through hate speech. And, obviously there's a big story going on at the moment, which is the advertising boycott of Facebook,
yes.
And a Stop Hate for Profit campaign, which has rolled up some of Facebook's biggest customers. Do you feel that the tide is starting to turn and we're going to see structural changes in the way that we see hate speech on tech platforms?
I do think there'll be a time for change because, many people have been talking about this, about regulation of the platforms and online harm legislation or changing behavior and culture. But money talks. When you have 100 advertisers pulling their advertising, things will be different because the fact is that the online platforms, and there are two main culprits of Facebook and Google, if you look at the searches and the amount of money that's actually spent. When you've got, companies pulling 45 million from our advertising budget on Facebook, these are significant numbers, and it will force the companies, I believe, to behave differently. And I think the key is transparency, because if these platforms are forced to publish their procedures and their algorithms and what it is they're doing and how they're actually dealing with the black box, then we'll have more of an idea of what they're doing with that data and how they're actually monitoring what the processes are about dealing with abuse and how they deal with fake news. But at the moment, we don't have any idea how it is that how their algorithms work. So I do think there's I think the advertisers pulling that money will talk, and I think they will be forced to behave differently now.
Thank you. Can I go to Robert Tansey now?
Hi there. Hi, Gina. Question is, given the UK's woeful record over many decades in delivering major infrastructure projects, do you think that Boris's call to shovels is even remotely credible as a way to economic recovery?
Gosh, so many of this again. I don't. And I suppose three main reasons. One is it's a distraction. I think it is really a political distraction that's going on now to distract from the failures to do with COVID and hoping that somehow people believe we're waking up from a nightmare and going into this great new future. And you can see that in using Roosevelt as a figurehead. But if you're really going to build for the future, build back better, if you look, everything has a 3-word soundbite because it's coming behind it. And as a marketeer, it is a power of 3. So you can see him coming when every time it's a 3-word slogan. But the fact is, to build back better, as they keep saying, for tomorrow, why would you build infrastructure of yesterday? The whole idea of building road, if you're really going to go and be revolutionary and progressive in the way you build for the future, it's about technology. It's about connectivity. It's not about roads. It's not about infrastructure of the old. It's about infrastructure of the future and science and technology and coding. And that's not what we've heard. And talking about retrofitting and the Green Deal, we haven't heard enough of that. So I think this is very much a distraction. And also, I look at Roosevelt and I think, well, what people haven't understood is that it wasn't just Roosevelt. He had one of the most, the greatest advisors in my book of all time, which was a guy called Jesse Jones, who was a common sense, entrepreneurial driven Texan who understood about how you make credit flow to unlock the wheels of the economy, how you invest in the future, how you actually limit bad behaviors in banks, in executives, and this is not what we're seeing. It can't just be a few sound bites. So I have little faith, actually, not just because of the timing of this, because it was announced today on the 30th, the last day of the extension. You know, the timing is also says a lot about how this government is operating. But where are the people around him to deliver what he's promising? And I can't actually see them.
Thank you. I know that I'll go to Lizzie next, but I know that Ishitha, his hand was up, and I don't know if you're still keen to say something, but if you are, I will come to you next. But otherwise, I'll go to Lizzie and then Paul and then Mark. Hello, Lizzie.
Thank you very much. And Gina, I mean, thank you for this evening. I particularly want to say I really enjoyed your autobiography. It was a really inspiring read. But my question was around going back to the point earlier about education. And I suppose I'm particularly struck about how is it around looking at changing the curriculum, changing the method of teaching, that both kind of try to overcome the issues that we have in society around racism, but also the issues we have around opportunity, and making sure that people going forwards will look to deal with things in a different way and to continue to respect the experts. So, you know, a lot of it about Brexit was also about people not really understanding what Brexit meant or what Europe was. And I think there's an issue around how we educate ourselves and how we educate our children. And I would be interested in your thoughts on that.
So Lizzie, I've been talking about this for a long time, in that I think that I would dismantle our education system and start from scratch almost, because what you can see in this crisis is our education system, our schools have actually become the places of taking up the slack for the lack of provision in social services. You know, teachers hardly teach most of the time. I speak to so many primary school teachers who are worrying about what the children are wearing. If they've got underwear at school, have they had a hot meal since last night? You know, how is their mental health? There is so much. They're almost a social service at the moment in so many schools, which is shocking to me, but it is a reality. But so that's a part of we have to talk about, is that what are schools there for? Are they there for teaching, or are they there as a social service? Whilst education is so important, there are other things that should be happening outside of schools and not inside. That's just my view. The other thing I would say is, where education is far too much of a political football. You cannot achieve a reorganizing and a reform of our education system that's very systemic and fundamental if you do it on a 3 to 5 year cycle. Surely what we need is for all political parties to agree that we will have an educational plan fit for the future, where we think about things like, if we're going to live longer, do our children still need to go to school at 4? Should they be going to school at 6? And we have something more akin to Nordic countries when they're younger, so they learn about resilience and confidence and humanities and compassion. So those skills that will give them the confidence to then learn. And then they go on to learning, and then they go on to training before maybe going on to university. I think we need to rethink education from beginning to end. And it's not just about saying we just substitute a few subjects in school. Just to give you an example, I'm the worst parent for my kids. So when my youngest daughter, who's 13, came home and said she's doing mindfulness lessons, I said, and she came home and explained to me what they were. I said, I don't want you to listen to your breath. I don't want you to think about you. I want you to be mindful of others. That's the mindfulness I want you to learn about other people mattering. So there's so much I would change in education. We don't do enough coding. We're still teaching in classrooms that you would have seen 40, 50 years ago. You know, that's why we're falling so far behind when it comes to the way we're performing as an economy. You know, where are the skills for tomorrow? Where are we teaching them? Oh, it's so much that we need to do, I think, to change. There's so many conversations we need to have with education. And when I speak to headmasters and to teachers, they're so desperate to have these conversations because they want to do their best and they are so committed to what they do. I just think there's so much we need to talk about.
Thank you. Thanks, Lizzie. Thanks, Gina. Since you mentioned Gina's autobiography, I would like to ask something about it. So your autobiography or your memoir, it's called Rise. It's a title inspired by Maya Angelou and her poem and the tone of defiance in the face of, you know, hostility and hate and defamation. And I'll just read that little section of that poem that it comes from. You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still like dust, I'll rise. It's a rallying cry for other women to make their voices heard. But I do wonder when I read your books and I hear you talk, you're so incredible. But I wonder if people will, instead of reading it like that, they'll see the abuse you get and how awful it is, and you know how you've had to high security and worry about your children and walk with your baseball cap down low at the worst of times. And I worry in some ways it might have the opposite effect, that people will look what's happened to you, you know, women particularly, and go, oh no thanks, I don't want a piece of that, I'll keep my head down. What do you think about that?
I hope it doesn't do that, because that's not why I wrote it. And you know, it is very raw. And what I wanted to do with the book was to, I noticed there were lots of books that, inspiring women, which were almost unattainable, because they made, you know, a lot of the readers were saying they made them feel worse, that these women were so incredible and successful at everything. I wanted to write about failures and how you deal with failure and how you actually talk about picking yourself up and starting again, because we're so concentrated in our education in talking about success. You know, dealing with failure is a very important learning tool or learning phase to go through as well. But I hope it doesn't do that. And what I'd say is that I particularly probably have lots of things that many other women probably don't have. Apparently, this is according to the Daily Mail. I have a certain voice, I look a certain way, I have an education, whatever it is, I'm the perfect avatar for hate, is the way they described me. So hopefully other women are not an avatar for hate.
You tick all the hate boxes.
But I mean, you know, all those tick boxes. But it's also, I think we are in a particular time. And I'd say to women, use your voice, but learn to use it, because it took me 30 years to get where I am. I didn't just suddenly pop up. And every day you try and you use your voice, maybe in a small way, maybe behind the scenes, because you don't always have to be the person at the front. You can be the collaborator, you can be the organizer. There's so many other ways to be a contributor to society and learn your craft. I mean, being an activist is actually something you learn. And you get to the point where I am now, where it's just part of my personality. And as my husband says, you know, I'm the biggest busybody there is. You know, I just can't help it. But it's just part of who I am now. But it took a long time to learn.
Okay, thanks, Gina. I'll go to Paul and Mark and then Jacqueline. Paul, you there?
Oh, Paul.
Hi again, Paul.
Yeah. Hello. Can you hear me all right?
Yep, I can hear you.
Excellent. I was going to get him.
Oh, actually, Paul, we can't hear you. You've cut out. We'll try and come back to you if we've got time, but you cut out. I'll go to Mark instead. Sorry, Paul.
Can you hear me?
Sorry, Paul.
Yep.
Hello,
Mark.
Hi, hello. My question is to Gina. It's about the reform of the EU. I think you mentioned in passing at the beginning that you were in favour of some reform of it, and I totally agree with people that the EU is not just about trade, and one of the big problems that's always existed is how to spread the message. It's about international cooperation and all those other things as well. But I'm very bothered about some of these economic policies, and I wonder to what extent you would extend your idea of reform to include reform of the economics, because it seems to me that a lot of what has happened is that it's brought some unpopularity upon itself by generating confusion and problems, particularly with regard to things like the introduction of the euro and its rather simplistic approach to labour mobility, which too often seems to play into the hands of big multinationals, and things like the deflationary bias of fiscal policy, which is built into the fiscal rules about budget deficits and so on. Do you think that if economic policies are not reformed radically by the EU, that there's a risk of it self-destructing? Because that's how I see it going in the next few decades if those things aren't altered.
I have to say, Mark, I think there is a self-destruct button, and that I've had these conversations with the European Parliament or some members of it, that they have not been fair in their fiscal policy when it comes to their junior members, if you like. but also the fact that now they have added threat because of China and future trade with some of the countries that are on the sidelines coming into the EU. The EU has got to address the way its economics, the way its banks work, the way its distribution of aid works, the state aid. They have got lots of issues. And one of the things that I think the French-German axis now understand is that they were quite arrogant in the past and not addressing that. And they are beginning to understand, but only beginning. And I have to say that's one of the tragedies for me, is that when we were at the table, they were more willing to talk to each other and to address these issues. But now we're not there. I wonder how it will progress. And if look at the way they've treated Greece, look at the way they're treating Poland, Turkey. There are issues on immigration, the way they've funded other people. They have to address this. And apparently, and I haven't seen it yet, there is something that they've drafted that's called the reforming of economics, which is being driven by some French economists about how the EU reforms. I haven't seen it yet, but I've been told that that's being drafted, and I really recommend that maybe you look out for that, and I definitely will be.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Jacqueline? Is there Jacqueline?
Oh.
Hello, Jacqueline.
Yeah, hello. Hi. Oh goodness, my son shows in the worst time to...
That's okay, he can sit, he can come in.
Yes, bring him in.
Actually outside playing and he's struggling to bike. But anyway, I won't stay too long. I wanted to ask about race. We're at a juncture where it seems as though people are listening or open to listening. And I just wanted to understand from Gina, based on what you've seen and how high you've climbed, the heights that you've climbed in your career, both as an entrepreneur and as a political figure, if you're happy to be referred to as that. How open to change do you believe that people in power, who hold real power, are? That's the first question. And secondly, I guess it ties into this, for the everyday, or for your average Brit, non-black Brit, that is, how open to change do you think they are, and what is it going to take to see a Britain where someone like me, who's been born here, lived here, grown up, working, can go to work without any microaggressions, no banter about how you look, your skin tone, your hair, can feel free? Do we have... I know that we have a tremendous amount of work to do, but how realistic do you think change is?
Well, we have to make it realistic. We have to make it happen. And I think the most important thing is the microaggressions, because I started in the city. I can give my own examples in 96 when I started working, and they were full-on aggressions. I mean, it wasn't hidden. And now it's so much more nuanced and so much more what you call microaggressions. I think we have to call it out. But I think the biggest barrier to change is what you don't see. It's the unconscious biases. It's the things you don't see. Because if you look in my world, in FTSE, wherever it is, if you end up with people who have physical diversity, but they've gone to the same schools, they've got the same mindset, the same unconscious biases, they have the same neuro biases, then we won't create real change, because their surface change, their surface diversity. So I think we really need to think about how do we actually get people in from very different socioeconomic groups, educational backgrounds. That is real diversity. When you stop the groupthink, when you stop the way people assimilate other people, that's when I think we'll see real change. But saying that, for example, in advertising now, every advertising company is going to have a mixed race couple or whatever it is in their advertising. Oh, okay, fine, very well. But what are you doing actually behind your business? What are you doing in your boardroom, in your hiring process, in your promotional process? What are you doing all the way through? Diversity can't just be another tick box, and race can't be another tick box, which is what I've seen in so many corporate environments. And a lot of that comes from the top. So we have to see it from the top. Culture comes from the top. And a lot of that is that it needs to come in businesses, but in the classroom as well. I'd say we have to start teaching a different type of history. I'm not talking about whitewashing or blackwashing history. I'm talking about teaching true history of what happened, because then people will have different mindsets, I believe. This is just my belief, but I think if we start with the young and then we start with the successful, they'll meet somewhere in the middle.
Thank you. And because we've got a couple of minutes left, so let's go to the couple of last hands up. It's Ishitha and then Susie.
Hi, Gina. I would like to ask, what are your thoughts on Cummings' remark about taking the knee? And do you think it has exacerbated racial tensions in the country? And what do you think could be used to combat this ignorance?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't actually listen to anything Cummings says. It's right. I mean, having a special advisor who is driven by ideology, I think is a very dangerous thing for us from a constitutional, democratic, cultural, social perspective. And also somebody who really understands and has people around him who understand how to use technology as a threat and to spread propaganda, I think is incredibly dangerous. But I would just say, I would ignore him. I wouldn't actually acknowledge. Sometimes when you acknowledge a comment, when you acknowledge an abuse, when you acknowledge something that someone says, you create the oxygen around it that then gives it life. And I would stifle it. I wouldn't even acknowledge it when it comes to those sorts of comments, because they're born out of ignorance and not compassion.
Thank you. And Susie, last word to Susie.
Okay, I'll just read the question I wrote, which is, as we slide into the negatives of small islander mentality, which is what I'm hearing, what countries would Gina look to as models to link with or aspire to?
Well, the Britain we used to be, actually.
Really?
No, some of it, not all of it. But I think the last few years is almost, it's not a great, it's so difficult. I do it in different ways. So from a democratic point of view, having a sort of, if you like, not a full deliberative democracy, but I think the Swiss model of voting and the way they run their democracy is something that I think is very interesting and we should look at. The idea that we are closer, the voters are closer to the politicians, and we have more ways of holding them to account, and the fact that they can't become career politicians. I think the whole accountability around the Swiss model of this deliberative democracy is really, really interesting. When it comes to a country where I think we have a leader who just oozes empathy and common sense, I would look to New Zealand. I think she's quite extraordinary. I think, the way she can articulate to her people and bring them through very difficult times is incredibly powerful. And then I suppose the other country I would look at right now, gosh, is probably, from a very practical point of view, is probably Singapore, only because of the way they deal with pandemics. And I think if we're going to go into an age of pandemics, then we have to have a very pragmatic country that we can model how we actually deal with those issues ourselves.
Thank you all. I'm so sorry I could not get to every question and thought that has been said and asked in the chat. It's just been mind-blowing how engaged you all are with Gina. Gina, you really are such an impressive person. You came to this country.
I had no idea what everyone's going to ask, and I've tried to answer as best I could.
No, you've done brilliantly. And, I just want to say, obviously you came to the country age 11, you survived, you've become a hugely successful businesswoman and a hugely admired figurehead in the Brexit movement. Maybe half the country, perhaps not the other half. You survived domestic abuse, unbelievable amounts of online abuse. And I think it takes real courage to do it in such a poised, calm and collected way. I've written down what you said about having the confidence to switch off from abusers, and that that women need to learn to use their voice, or to learn to use it, that you're not born an activist, that you became one over 30 years. A couple of things I've written down for Tortoise to follow up. Money talks and the campaign against the tech platforms, which will force them to behave differently, that we have to be mindful of how we use judicial review. I think that that's something quite interesting for Tortoise to look at. And of course, everything you said about education, we had a huge education summit last week and you were echoing a lot of the interesting points that came out there. You said at the start, we can't be an isolated nation when we have such global problems. That's something really significant that you said, that our strength was in our soft power, and that's what we've thrown away. And I love those countries that you looked to at the end. I've written those down, the Swiss model of how we run our democracy, and having a more deliberative, close democracy would be interesting, and of course Singapore with how they deal with pandemics. I also wrote down that your husband said that you were the biggest busybody there is, and maybe not everyone agrees with you, but we are grateful for your busybodying and all your views tonight. So thank you so much for coming on and answering all those different questions, and for your thoughts on so much on this important night for Brexit as well. So thank you, Gina. Thanks to everyone. As ever, we don't know how to sign these things off, so we just have to do an awkward wave rather than a clap. But thank you all, and I hope to see you again soon.